Good evening. I'm Warren Finch, the Acting Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I thank you for coming this evening, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us online as well. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters for the Kennedy Library Forums, the lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. Richard Aldous has kindly agreed to sign books after tonight's forum. Our bookstore has copies of his books available for purchase. This year marks the centennial of John F. Kennedy's birth. As we honor his life and legacy during this centennial year, we cannot be more pleased to explore the life and work of Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in more detail tonight. I am delighted to introduce the participants in tonight's program. We are so pleased to welcome Richard Aldous, author of the new biography, Schlesinger, the Imperial Historian. He is a professor of history at Bard College and the author and editor of 11 books, including Macmillan, Eisenhower and the Cold War, and Reagan and Thatcher, The Difficult Relationship. I am also delighted to introduce our moderator for the evening, an old colleague of mine, Timothy Naftali, a professor of history and public service at New York University. He is an award-winning author, a CNN presidential historian, and also served as the director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum. Please join me in welcoming Richard and Timothy.
Thank you, Warren, and thank all of you. Richard, you've written a wonderful book, which you will all have the opportunity of purchasing, and take it. Why did you decide to write about Arthur Schlesinger?
First of all, can I just say what a real pleasure it is to be here at the JFK Library, and I'm very grateful for the invitation, and also wonderful to be interviewed by such a fine Kennedy historian. I think the answer to that question, actually in some ways, maybe the real answer lies in my childhood, that Arthur Schlesinger was one of the first historians, proper historians, that I read. And I can still see the gold spine of the British edition of 1,000 Days on my father's bookshelf. And I only realized this fairly recently, that when I look back, the very first newspaper article that I wrote quoted Schlesinger. The very first academic article that I wrote quoted Schlesinger. And I think for me, kind of more recently, I realized that he is the very epitome of the historian as, if you like, the action intellectual, the public intellectual. And I was fascinated by the way in which he traversed those two different worlds, excelling in both, but also controversial in both.
What were the surprises for you as you did your research?
I think that, I mean, in some ways, the first surprise was, as a historian, that this is a man who kept everything. He knew what a historian or a biographer, people like us, could do with this material. But I'm fairly sure, looking through the papers, that he doesn't destroy any of the material there. There's some very personal things in the archive that he's kept. One of the slightly disconcerting things is that very often, because he wrote his own memoirs, you can actually see him having already read the papers that me as his biographer is reading too. But I think that the real surprise, that in some ways the best quality about Arthur Schlesinger the man is that quite clearly he is the same in private as he is in public. He's not saying things in his private correspondence that he isn't prepared to go on the record and say. So there's a kind of integrity about him that he really does say what he believes, and very often that means speaking truth to power too.
Well, we're at the Kennedy Library, and tell us how you understand now, having written this fine book, Arthur Schlesinger's relationship with John F. Kennedy.
It's a fascinating relationship, isn't it? As Warren said in his introduction, this is the centenary of John F. Kennedy and also the centenary of Arthur Schlesinger, both born in 1917. Yet in a curious kind of way, they almost don't seem like contemporaries, and in many ways they actually weren't. That because Schlesinger was fast-tracked through school, it means that although he was at Harvard, he wasn't in the same year as John F. Kennedy. He was actually in the same year as Kennedy's older brother. And, I think that relationship always has about it a kind of curious quality of both being an insider but not part of the Kennedy circle. And ultimately, I think the thing that brings them together is not some of the usual things, throwing a football at Hyannisport and so on. It is actually the relationship as a historian, that Kennedy loved history, was a writer, thought of himself as a historian, and so where they really bonded was over history.
We're going to talk a bit about this, I hope, over the course of our conversation and during the Q&A, but to what extent do you think President Kennedy was comfortable sharing his thinking with Arthur Schlesinger?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think he's very comfortable in the company of Arthur Schlesinger, that Schlesinger is somebody who, inside the White House, he would quite often just drop by at the end of the day. Kennedy would beckon him into the Oval, whoever was in there, and invite him to join those conversations. He quite often liked ruminating with Schlesinger about, well, what was this like with in the days of Grover Cleveland or Polk or Truman or whoever. So he liked those aspects. But as well as I do, Tim, that Kennedy was interesting in that he was never really close to anyone. Robert Dallek makes this point in his book about the Kennedy court, that he uses people where they're useful. He enjoys people's company. But even the kind of characters like Dave Powers, they're not really, nobody really gets close to him. And this is something that I've come to realize over a number of presidents that I've looked at and worked on. Reagan was very similar, that it is almost a characteristic of those who serve with distinction in the Oval Office, that there is actually something unknowable about them.
You make very good use of the entirety of Arthur's diaries. There's an edited version, but actually a lot of the most interesting materials are not in the edited published version. You use the whole version. To what extent do you think Arthur Schlesinger felt he got the elusive Kennedy? Because he understood this too about Kennedy. To what extent does he believe he actually understood the president?
I think that, in some ways, as you say, he understands the elusive quality as well. And actually, one of the things that he faces once he starts writing 1,000 Days is how to reconcile his own relationship with Kennedy. Let's not forget that in 1959 and 1960, he was unsure about Kennedy. Ultimately, he thinks, well, Stevenson, who he's close to, probably doesn't deserve another shot. But he kind of flirts with the idea that maybe Stevenson should have another go. He's not part of the inner circle. And one of the reasons why, and what he has to confront again after Kennedy's assassination, is that in his heart of hearts he knows that Kennedy is not a liberal in the sense that he understands it. That Kennedy in many ways is a conservative president with a small c. And so part of the intellectual job that he does for Kennedy is almost reconfiguring him as a more progressive figure, trying to reconcile him not being a liberal with his conservative instincts, and instead recasting him as a progressive kind of a president.
Well, let's step back for a moment, because this might be surprising to some of the people listening. How would Arthur have described liberal? What did it mean to be a liberal in Arthur's era?
And that's, in some ways, that's a kind of an interesting question and difficult question to answer, because Schlesinger himself is constantly parsing what it means to be a liberal. But I think that, in particular, he has this kind of sense of politics as an educational process. He likes the educational presidents, most particularly Roosevelt, who sees politics as a way of kind of identifying things which are in the public good, not just kind of efficient things that can be improved. And that's one of the things that he has to deal with Kennedy. Kennedy is more of an efficient technocratic president than Schlesinger necessarily would have liked.
Well, why don't we lay out for people what kinds of decisions would fit in this category of being technocratic rather than Schlesingerian liberal?
So, I mean, for example, when Kennedy deals with the whole question of civil rights, it's not something that he comes into office seeing as a kind of a burning desire to address an injustice. Instead, it's when he sees, for example, the events of Birmingham, and he recognizes that within a kind of democratic society, here is an ill that needs to be addressed. That this is something which is, yes, it's wrong, but he comes to that realization not necessarily through a kind of as I say, a burning desire to correct something or a burning kind of inner belief. It's because it's inefficient within society, and that's why he moves incrementally on it.
So are you saying that for Arthur Schlesinger, a liberal had to be passionate?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think and also a kind of a sense that, as I say, that politics is about more than efficiency, that it's about this kind of sense of looking at society, kind of understanding how you fit within this progressive arc that runs through, as he would conceive it, through characters like Andrew Jackson and President Roosevelt, FDR, and then kind of someone like Adlai Stevenson, who he did see as a more progressive liberal character. Although interestingly, when he was working for Stevenson in the 1950s, he had many of the same reservations about Stevenson's liberalism.
Would you say that Arthur Schlesinger had this idea of the perfectibility of America, that it was always getting better?
Yes, absolutely. And there's a kind of an underlying Whig notion to Schlesinger's history, very much something that he gets from his father. I mean, Arthur Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s father, is somebody who develops this kind of notion of progressive kind of history, is somebody who looks at history through the idea of cycles, that America goes through these progressive and conservative cycles, and that's something which Arthur Jr. kind of then subsequently picks up and writes a book about.
What does he think the role of the individual is in creating a more perfect America?
Well, certainly for himself, this is one of the reasons why he thinks that historians should participate in that process, that it's not enough for Arthur Schlesinger just simply to be writing books, that the historian has to apply the lessons of history in a direct way by participating. So even in his own individual case, yes, he does believe in the individual. And then you look at his books, I mean, The Age of Roosevelt, The Age of Jackson, kind of very much looking at the role of the individual, but also, just think of the title of those books, The Age of, there's a kind of a sense of a generation grappling with these kind of problems, and a generation as a cohort kind of moving forward too.
Now, before he writes, because he'll have this crisis of confidence about this when he writes The Imperial Presidency. But what role does he see the president playing before the 70s in achieving sort of these Augustan ages?
Yeah, so, you could make an argument, and in fact, I do in the book, that, actually, almost his entire frame of reference is governed by one individual and one president, and of course that's FDR. That, The Age of Jackson, in many ways, is a book about Roosevelt as much as it is one about the 19th century, and then obviously The Age of Roosevelt itself is trying to take those lessons and to apply them in the specific context to Stevenson and to Kennedy. But yeah, he believes that to use a Churchillian phrase, that the president is the person who sets the weather. The person who sets the tone for policy. But also one of the lessons that he learns from Roosevelt is that it's not enough simply to be the weather maker, that Roosevelt takes his experience from the First World War when he was an assistant secretary for the Navy, and he understands that a president has to dig right down into his administration, has to follow decisions through, has to not just talk to somebody from the State Department about a State Department issue. You might have someone from agriculture in, and you'll just ask him about some matter, that you're constantly driving your agenda by making sure that at every level of government it's something that's being understood.
Now, this book is also about people as well as ideas. And one of those people, of course, is Arthur. Why don't you share, because the book has a number of these examples of Arthur's struggles. We think of him, those who knew him and those who've read about him, as a success, a man who enjoyed success after success after success. But in your book, it's clear that wasn't the case, nor did he see his life that way. Tell us a bit about that very human side of Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that he elides in his own memoirs, that he does tend to smooth over the struggles which he'd had. And, on one level, it was a very smooth life. Pulitzer Prize when he was still in his 20s, Harvard professorship, a special assistant to the president, another Pulitzer Prize. That he has a record of success that is enviable. But he's in a very nice public school, doing very nicely when he's a boy. But his parents are very ambitious, and they shift him up 2 years. And he goes from being somebody who plays baseball and sports and is kind of just a normal kind of boy, to suddenly being the little squirt. He talks about how that's the age where he starts wearing glasses and he's smaller and he's not very sporty. And he struggles at school. He goes to his parents pull him out of another school, send him off to Felix Exeter, where, again, he struggles, not just because of his size and age, but because he's surrounded by people who are much, much wealthier than him. And so there's that kind of struggle. He goes off with OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, during the Second World War. And again, he finds it very, very difficult. He's unable to really make close friendships. He makes some very important enemies who, to a very large degree, persecute him while he's there. But the one thing that always pulls him back, the constant in his life, something very local here, is Harvard. So that when he's at school, he realizes that the person he wants to become is his father, a Harvard professor. So much so that he changes his name from Arthur Bancroft Schlesinger to Arthur Mayer Schlesinger Jr. So, because he literally wants to become his father. When he's in OSS, he's able to pull at various times contacts to kind of provide favors to smooth things over for him. And even the way in which Arthur Sr. is able to maneuver things to get him to make sure that he gets his fellowship at the Society for Fellows, or that the offer from Harvard is kind of forthcoming, even on kind of various prizes. His father is very influential. So there's a sense in which he's both an outsider and an insider, but ultimately the Harvard connection, even with JFK, the Harvard connection is something which is a kind of an unmoving part of his life, and very often rescues him.
I think someone coming to your book who hasn't spent a lot of time at the library might be surprised at how Arthur Schlesinger was not in the inner circle of the Kennedy administration. Mm-hmm. And from your book, I get the sense that he was frustrated by that.
He was frustrated on one level because I think that once he goes to the White House, he doesn't feel that he's able to influence events as much as he would want to. So there's a kind of a sense of frustration that is personal, but in some ways that frustration is born of realizing that as a special assistant without special responsibilities, for example, at one stage it's mooted that perhaps he'll become the National Security Advisor. So that's something that would have had real kind of authority and a staff that went with it. But he's a gadfly. And so, on days that Kennedy wants to see him or is amused by him or is taking him seriously, he can have an impact. But at other times, you're right, he feels frustrated because he's not able to make that kind of influence, have that kind of influence with the president.
But on occasion, he has an impact. So let's talk about those occasions where he does have an impact on policy.
Yeah, so I think that in many ways there's a learning curve for him because events that you've written about demonstrate this. During the Bay of Pigs, he's right about the Bay of Pigs. He's one of the few people in the lead up to the Bay of Pigs who says, you shouldn't do this. He first of all doesn't say this face to face to Kennedy, and then he kind of curses himself and he goes back to his office and he writes a memo saying to the president quite clearly, don't do this. And then he tells Kennedy this. He then goes to see Dean Rusk, and eventually Bobby Kennedy says to him, enough, stop. And so at that point, he has to do that. The lesson he learns from that is it's not enough to be right. You have to be heard. And so on the things covered in One Hell of a Gamble, once it gets to Berlin, he's able to be heard and to have an influence. That someone like Dean Acheson is taking a very hawkish line on this. Schlesinger says to Kennedy, you have to learn the lesson of the Bay of Pigs. You have to widen your circle. You have to get all kinds of opinions. So, for example, he brings Henry Kissinger, who's a consultant at the White House, in there, and he writes a series of memos to Kennedy, making clear what his policy should be. And he's able to be heard, and he influences Kennedy. And you could make an argument, it's a stretch, but you could make an argument that in doing that, he establishes the kind of the way in which Kennedy then deals with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So although Schlesinger is on the outside there, the way in which Kennedy has successfully dealt with Berlin using Schlesinger's model has kind of long-standing ramifications.
And you talk about his role in shaping policy towards Italy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, Italy is a good example of one of his major frustrations, the State Department, and in 1,000 Days, it's one of the few things that he does where he stabs at somebody. Dean Rusk kind of is sliced and diced in that book. But yeah, you're right, that he believes in something called, he's written in the 1940s about the vital center, the need to encourage the non-communist left. When he sees this emerge in Italy, something called the opening to the left, he wants Kennedy to encourage a broad coalition in Italy that takes in the non-communist left and pushes the communists out in Italy. So yeah, that's a good example of something that he takes an interest in and that he pursues in this kind of gadfly kind of a way.
In a sense, it's really a follow-on to the vital center. It's building
exactly.
It's not being afraid of social democrats, knowing full well that they're as anti-communist as conservatives are.
Yeah, and that in a way is all part of the context of the younger Schlesinger. That it's one of the things that we have to remember. is that he grew up in the 1930s. He, to some extent, he has this kind of Manichaean worldview that sees the rise of fascism and Nazism on one side, Stalinism on the other side, and kind of Rooseveltian democracy as a kind of a beacon in the middle. So by the time you get to the 40s, having worked in OSS, seen penetration by people like Morris Halperin, who he worked with, who almost certainly was a Soviet agent, he recognizes that you have to find a way for the non-communist left and the non-fascist right to work together in a way that excludes extremes. And I think it's one of the reasons that there's been a lot more interest in that book, The Vital Centre, recently, because there's a sense in which it resonates because it speaks so strongly about the democratic project.
When you get the sense of Arthur's experience, Arthur's White House, Arthur's 1,000 Days, you also tell stories that most people wouldn't know about Ted Sorensen, and Ted Sorensen's strained during the 1,000 Days strained relationship with Arthur.
Yeah, Ted Sorensen is one of the greatest speechwriters, presidential speechwriters of all time. And actually, Schlesinger and Sorensen, towards the end of their life, actually do become kind of much better friends. But there's no sense that they were there's no sense in which they weren't rivals during this period. It all starts, interestingly enough, with Profiles in Courage, that Kennedy sends the draft to Schlesinger, who goes through it with his red pen or maybe his blue pencil, kind of making suggestions. And he speaks in a way that is entirely appropriate to speak to Senator Kennedy, but it's Sorensen who's written so much of the initial draft. Sorensen feels very resentful at effectively being humiliated in front of Senator Kennedy, his boss at that stage. That follows through right into the White House. Sorensen will do almost anything to stop Schlesinger getting his hands on speeches. So very often Kennedy will slip a speech to Schlesinger and say, "Don't tell Ted." And so Schlesinger will make these changes, and then Kennedy will kind of maybe write them out or make sure that... but then sometimes Kennedy would put the two of them into direct competition and say, just work it out. The interesting thing is that something happens immediately after the assassination, though, because during the White House years, there's no question that Sorensen is more important and more influential than Schlesinger. He is the president's voice. But after the assassination, it's Schlesinger who becomes more important to the Kennedy project because he is the one who is going to define the legacy. So he's more important for the family. He's more important for Robert Kennedy redefining. He's more important even for the current president, LBJ. Sorensen is a brilliant speechwriter, and although he writes a very good book on Kennedy, he's up against Schlesinger, Pulitzer Prize winner, Harvard professor, somebody who's much more experienced in the process of actually writing and producing a book. So Sorensen really struggles with the process. And that inevitably, because the press focus on the rivalry, even when they left the White House within weeks of each other, the White House staff threw a party and they produced a cake with Sorensen and Kennedy kind of on the cake, racing towards a kind of big pot of gold. And it said on the cake, may the best man win. So there was a kind of sense in which this rivalry is stoked between the two, and they felt it very intensely.
I think it's about 5 years ago, the library released Schlesinger's interviews with Jacqueline Kennedy. And Jacqueline Kennedy on those tapes, and you should listen if you haven't already, is very at ease. And your book explains why. What was the origin of this close relationship and partnership in the Kennedy project
between
Jacqueline Kennedy and
No,
Arthur.
you're quite right, and I think this is a good example of where, although that's available in a kind of book format, but also with a CD or through kind of Audible or something, that it's really worth listening to them, because the ease and even the fact that you can sometimes you hear the clink of ice as the kind of drinks are being poured and kind of so on, and as I think is well known, Natalie Portman kind of listened to those interviews when she prepared for her role as kind of playing Jackie Kennedy. But I think that the relationship comes about kind of initially in the 1950s, because partly it's the answer, the thing that we were talking about before, that Schlesinger is outside of the circle. Kennedy has his own team, and one of the ways in which he says to Schlesinger, if you want to get things to me or vice versa, let's go through Jackie. So they kind of become almost like a political partnership right from the very beginning, and they do enjoy each other's company. That he suffers the humiliation of being moved from the West Wing to the East Wing, which he is quite kind of cross about. But the advantage of that is that he's in the East Wing with Jackie. And so they're always sitting there kind of talking, and if you have the ear of Jackie, you have the ear of the president. So they have this very close relationship. They work on projects together, like for example the establishment of the White House Library. But then where that also pays dividends is immediately after the assassination, where she doesn't like Sorensen. She encourages Schlesinger in the project. They work kind of very, very closely together. But I think it's only that relationship that means, and this shows kind of almost what I was talking about before, how Schlesinger relentlessly says what he thinks, that on the night that Kennedy is assassinated, he writes to Jacqueline Kennedy a very moving letter about the president and his legacy. The day after, it's dated the 23rd, he writes again to Jacqueline Kennedy and says immediately, you have to start thinking about the papers, you have to start thinking about the president's legacy. Now that's a very hard letter for somebody to write, but it shows, I think, the closeness of the relationship, but also the sense already implicit and understood in their relationship that he is the historian who is going to be involved in that legacy project for all of the advantages and disadvantages that would be involved in that.
Now, I've heard from a number of people, from what was left of the inner circle in the last 15 years, who would describe Arthur Schlesinger as not JFK's friend, but Bobby's friend. That it's Bobby who brought him into the White House. You argue that Bobby is the one who ultimately tells him about his job. But to what extent did the relationship between Robert Kennedy and Arthur Schlesinger matter in the White House period? We'll talk about how it mattered afterwards. To what extent did it matter then?
I think you're right to certainly express what I sense as the ambivalence of the relationship. That Robert Kennedy is involved in the Stevenson campaign in the second time round in '56, and Schlesinger finds him a slightly odd, kind of cold fish in many ways. And I think that there's a sense in which, particularly in that early period, Robert Kennedy is both volcanic and distant at the same time, and Schlesinger doesn't really quite know what to make of him. There's a sense of pragmatism in the relationship as things move on. He is the president's brother. Marion Kennedy, who, as many of you will know, sadly died, although at a spectacularly great age, and was a wonderful character. She was not enamored of Robert Kennedy, and when she accompanied Robert Kennedy with Arthur to Berlin and to Italy, was not impressed with his behavior. But as you say, it's really after the White House that the relationship blossoms and becomes important. So there's a pragmatism to it that later turns into something much closer.
To what extent is 1,000 days, in your estimation as a historian, a history of the Kennedy presidency? Or is it an imagining, a beautiful imagining of a liberal presidency that Arthur had hoped would have happened?
I think it's both. And I think it's really important to say, and it's one of the things that very often gets forgotten and certainly is brushed aside by Schlesinger's critics, is that he says right at the very beginning, virtually the first sentence, that this is a personal memoir, that it's written in the heat of the moment, that documents will be released at the JFK Library, he says, and other historians will come and they will write a more balanced account. But what he says in that introduction is that what I can give is that sense of what it was like to be in the room. And inevitably, this won't be balanced because I wasn't in the room for everything. You know, he says that explicitly, that I will inevitably give more emphasis to things that I was involved in. That's inevitable. So I think that there is that. And there is the word that you used, there's a romantic imagining kind of behind this book, because it's still written, I suppose today we would say there's a kind of an element of post-traumatic shock about it. There's an element of trauma to the book, that this is a man who kind of just the year previously had resigned his Harvard professorship, had fully expected that he would serve out the first term. Barry Goldwater was already likely to be the candidate. The Kennedy people were confident they could beat Goldwater. So he was expecting to be in the White House for the full 8 years. And then, almost as not quite a retirement project, but you know, this would have been kind of 1968, by this stage 69, in fact, by the time he would have gone. So it would have been his last big book. It would have been The Age of Kennedy, maybe multi-volume. But the book becomes something very different. You know, it's run off his Rolodex and his contacts and his memories. It's written in the kind of the heat of the moment. There's this kind of rivalry with Sorensen, so it has to be done quickly.
You described the physical toll that it takes on Arthur. He writes it in a year, right?
He did just over a year, and you know, I'm sorry, we can say this as history. He's basically putting the rest of us to shame. You know, he describes how he writes. You know, he's writing 3,000 words a day. He's getting up at kind of 7 o'clock in the morning, finishing at kind of 9 o'clock at night. Basically, all he's doing is writing and drinking whiskey and smoking cigars.
Well, you quoted someone writing that he writes directly to Galley.
Yeah, that's John Bloom who says that,
which means he doesn't need editing. That's what that means.
Yeah, that so John Bloom says that Schlesinger, he tells his graduate students this, that a very good friend and colleague of mine, Mark Lytle, was taught by John Bloom, and he says that Bloom used to say that the only people he knew of who could write almost directly for galleys are Churchill and Arthur Schlesinger. So he's a wonderfully fluent writer. He's banging out 3,000 words a day. And that was actually something that made him very politically useful as well. Galbraith talks about how when the two of them were speechwriters for Stevenson, that again, Schlesinger was the person who would walk into the Elks Club, as they were called. He would take off his jacket. He would sit at his desk, light a cigar, and he would just bang out a speech and then pull it out of the typewriter, and it was ready to go. So there was this kind of wonderful fluency about the way in which he wrote.
Now, all that energy, all that excitement, he doesn't have about the RFK book. He's not sure he wants to write it. I think that he realizes that inherent in writing that book are the faults that are in that book.
that by the time he gets to writing that, he's too close to the project. Don't forget the personal dimension to this. He's lost one president, somebody who he was close to in a kind of a professional kind of a way. By the time we get to 1968, as we discussed, he's friends with Robert Kennedy. Kennedy is assassinated. And also, he's worn down by the times. He's writing in the context of the kind of polarization of American politics, of the Watergate crisis. This is a time when he's in various he could be just in a cinema, for example, watching a movie, and somebody would just turn around and say, when the revolution comes, you're going to be taken and put against a wall and shot. Just when he's out, literally doing his business, that for example, he would walk his son to the bus stop, or would be walking the dog, and people would just start shouting at him in the street. So he's very, I think when he writes that book, he's writing a kind of a sense of an America that is lost. There are also technical problems with the book, that when he writes about RFK during the White House years, it becomes, who's the hero of the book? Because so much of it is talking about JFK, that Robert Kennedy almost becomes secondary in his own biography. So there are things that he's never quite able to reconcile, I think.
And what do you think? Perhaps there's one other thing, which is that between the writing of 1,000 Days and the RFK book, Arthur learns things about the Kennedy presidency he didn't know. You've had these revelations about from the Church Committee about attempts to kill Castro. There's more about the president's health. There is, and RFK is the one who told the world there was the secret deal that ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. The president's health, Arthur may have known something about, but the other things he didn't know anything about. And he didn't know about the taping system. And he's the historian. And he wasn't told about the best source of information about this presidency. John F. Kennedy didn't tell him. And Jackie, who also knew about it, didn't tell him. So to what extent do you think some of the RFK book, that the different tone is a product of his disappointment? Because he has to redo 1,000 Days a little bit. And as a result, I think has a very defensive tone.
Yeah, and as you say, it's a sense of disappointment that, and he's having to try to square the circle in ways that he doesn't do very successfully. That things like Operation Mongoose, as you say, things like the missiles and kind of the revelations about kind of Kennedy's kind of indiscretions, or what we very often describe as the darker side of Camelot. And I think that you're right about the defensive tone, because whatever you say about 1,000 Days, there's a sense in which it's a genuine book. There are things that may not have turned out to be right. There are things where his judgment may be wrong. But as a historian, you can look at those things, and by and large, even with the romanticized things, there's an authenticity to that book. As you say with RFK, even as a historian, he's written about some of these things. The imperial presidency, he talks a little bit about Kennedy kind of taking things on, but in many ways, things like the Turkish missiles or kind of mongoose are exactly the kind of thing that he's criticizing in the imperial presidency. And so to some degree, he's not exactly humiliated, but he is, his analysis is kind of off beam in that earlier book. And so, as you say, he's having to come and write about it. I think, as a historian, if we step back, it was a very popular book. There are parts of it which are very effective. But I think as a historian, you would have to say that it's not effective in the way that earlier books like The Age of Roosevelt or The Age of Jackson or 1,000 Days are.
And before we go to question and answers, The volume 4, I guess it would have been, of The Age of Roosevelt is like the white whale or the holy grail in this book. I don't know how many times you have Arthur saying to somebody, the book's the next thing I'm going to do. It sounds a little like a book about Kennedy that I will finish, actually. But why do you think? Because there was some pop psychology about why Arthur Schlesinger didn't finish it. He had too much fun at parties. As his biographer, as his also intellectual biographer, because this book is as much an intellectual biography as it is the story of Arthur's struggles and his rivalry with Ted and all that. Why do you think he didn't finish volume 4?
So I think there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, you're right that, I mean, he's just constantly referring to it, and that, you know, there's some part of you that just wants to, oh, Arthur, just let it go. Because, I mean, even when he takes up the White House job, he says, you know, I only want to do this for a year because I want to get back to the Age of Roosevelt. And all through his life, he's kind of constantly talking about it. We know that it's not laziness. I mean, it's not that because he writes the Imperial Presidency, he writes the Robert Kennedy book, and he writes many more kind of what you might describe as op-ed type books as well. I think it's two things. First of all, we all know that when you write a book, there's a kind of intellectual energy that is behind the original idea, and if you don't seize that intellectual energy, then the fires tend to dim and you move on to other things, and it's difficult to reclaim that. But I think there's another reason, and the clue is in the 1950s, when actually he's still in the process of writing the kind of the earlier volumes. He goes to London and gives a series of lectures at University College London, which his own father had given in the 1930s. The reason why he changed his name to Arthur Mayer Jr. was because he had to get a passport to go on a round-the-world trip with his father. So this had been a kind of a seminal trip for him. He does the same lectures in the 1950s, and they're basically about Volume 4. And when he's there, he almost can't write them even then. That he turns up, he hasn't done them properly, he sees who's got all of the luminaries turned out, he rushes back to his hotel to kind of fill in details. So I think that even then he knew there was a problem. And why is there a problem, in answer to your kind of question? In some ways it's almost like the RFK thing, that the problem is that he's written about the good bit of FDR. He stops in 1936. But he's going to have to deal with the Supreme Court controversy. He's going to have to deal with the Holocaust. He's going to have to deal with isolationism. By this stage, he reveres Roosevelt so much. I'm just not sure that maybe it's being a good historian. He realizes that by now he's the wrong man to write the history of FDR in that period.
Arthur Schlesinger was very good to me, and so I would have had the opportunity to ask him, and I'm sorry I hadn't read your book. I'm sorry you didn't write the book when he was alive. We could ask him, but I would have wanted to ask him whether, having been in a White House, because you see, most of us who write about presidents none of us are president, but most of us haven't worked in a White House. And even the ones who worked in White Houses haven't been very close to the president. Given that he was close to a president and then learned what he didn't know about that presidency, how confident could he be of writing about a presidency that occurred when he was 20 years old and far away? Did he lose some of his self-confidence about the ability to recreate an administration given his experience in the Kennedy administration? I would have loved to have asked him.
Yeah, and I think that's a really fascinating question, because he ruminates on this notion of keyhole history or the historian as participant and all of those things. I think the other thing that we have to remember is that when he was strictly an academic historian, writing on Orestes Brownson, with his very first book coming out of his senior thesis at Harvard, and then Andrew Jackson, he's writing about the 19th century, but thereafter, he's actually always writing about contemporary history. You know, he's writing about Roosevelt in the 1950s, when Roosevelt only died in 1945. So that would be like us writing a book about President George W. Bush or maybe Bill Clinton. So there's a sense in which this is a kind of contemporary history. And so, as you say, maybe it's also that by the time he gets back round to Roosevelt, it's not really contemporary history anymore. So maybe the contemporary side of it is the animating force. And as I said earlier, even The Age of Jackson, in some ways, is a book about the age of Roosevelt.
Let's take some questions. Let's see. Great.
It seems like Schlesinger was a very, very unique historic figure in the United States presidency. And has there ever been another person who is his equivalent in the 20th century, and dare I say, I'll even ask it in the 21st century, because it seems like there never has been and probably never will be. And it appears that really what we see when we look at Schlesinger is the respect that President Kennedy had for history and for learning from history. I recall reading once that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he made some statement about there was some book he had just recently read, and he said, I wish the generals had read this book. I would send them a copy, but they probably wouldn't read it anyway. But is that how unique Schlesinger is, that we can say that he doesn't have an equal in the history of the American presidency? Or is there someone else who is his equal that served a president?
I think that's a really interesting question, because, you know, Schlesinger himself says when he comes into the White House that there's been nobody like me before. There have been other people who've written about presidents, who've been within the circle, but nobody brought in quite that way. And in some ways, he sets kind of a precedent. So, for example, when Bill Clinton becomes president, he's a great admirer of Arthur Schlesinger. He wants somebody like Schlesinger there, so he talks to Taylor Branch, a kind of very distinguished historian, and says to him, I want you to be my Arthur Schlesinger. And Taylor Branch is, Mr. President, I'm not sure that's actually a very good precedent, but he does. Taylor Branch eventually, as you know, does go into the White House. He does have these conversations with the president. And there are other examples. A biographer of Teddy Roosevelt then is given access by Ronald Reagan and writes a kind of actually quite controversial biography of Reagan. So there are ways in which writers come in. But I think your question is right in one sense. There's nobody who really is brought in the same way as somebody who's influencing policy, who is understanding what is going on, is involved in decision-making, but who right from day one, I think it's understood, certainly it's understood, I believe, by Kennedy, that actually you're here because ultimately you're going to have another task. That in some ways you are going to be writing or involved in or helping in the Age of Kennedy project.
Thank
you. Yes, I wish you would enlarge a little bit about the statement you made earlier with regard to the fact that Schlesinger, he had progressive proclivities, almost in a sense we could say a Whiggish sensibility with regard to history. And I was just struck in reading some of Schlesinger's essays by the fact that he seemed to have been influenced profoundly by Reinhold Niebuhr. And Reinhold Niebuhr, the centerpiece of Niebuhr's thinking, had to do with the ineradicable flaw in human nature that was manifested historically. And it seemed to me that when Schlesinger would reflect upon different historical periods, he would always be mindful of the fact that we're moving piecemeal, always imperfectly. Every situation is inherently flawed, and it's always a work in progress. As a matter of fact, it was some of the people like, when he'd addressed historians like William Appleman Williams or Noam Chomsky, he would always impute the fact that you have this grand design conception, as though that, they've got people, people engineering these huge, spacious plans for decades and decades. And he says that, we talk about the end of the Second World War. He says, he's talking about men who are beleaguered, tired, old, sick, exhausted, and he says they're making piecemeal arrangements. He says to impute grand designs is irreconcilable with, the realistic conception of history.
Yes, and you're quite right, of course, to identify Reinhold Niebuhr as a mentor, both personally and intellectually, to Arthur Schlesinger. One historian has written, and I think this is right, that effectively what Schlesinger did was to take Reinhold Niebuhr's conservative analysis and apply it for progressive ends. So, he takes on board this kind of idea, even kind of quoting, and in fact I'm going to misquote here, so I apologize to everyone for this, but he quotes the words of Pascal in one of his books, and Reinhold Niebuhr quoting Pascal, and the gist of which is that one of the problems for mankind, we are brutes, affect not just because we always want to act in a way that is evil, but very often because we want to act in a way that is good. And so he's kind of very wary of this kind of sense of, as you say, kind of proceeding kind of carefully. But what Schlesinger does is to take that and to say, well, because of this, we can look at these kind of, we can look at the trends, we can have these kind of progressive ends, and we can move in that direction, but always being aware that we have to test these things, for example, against history, that we have to be aware of our own proclivities, and so on. So, yeah, Reinhold Niebuhr is a great influence, including personally that the two men were great friends. Schlesinger was very kind to Niebuhr after he'd had his stroke, for example, organising kind of people getting together to buy him a television so he could watch TV and kind of so on. So it's personal, but absolutely, as you described there, it's intellectual.
Thank you.
Well, a little aside, do you have any comments on the potential release of the JFK Papers? What are you looking for?
I have to say that I'm probably the wrong person to ask that question to. We have someone who's a real expert on that sitting next to us. I would say that, two things, that for any historian, the release of documents is always an exciting thing for all the redactions that will be there. Maybe that some of the best material. It will probably take years for historians to work through and to pull out the implications, but and no doubt it will feed some of the conspiracy theories around this event. But yeah, any documents released is a boon for historians. But as I say, here is the expert. You should probably ask him to comment on that, Tim.
We are all, oddly enough, in the debt of Oliver Stone. I say that oddly enough because he created a cockamamie conspiracy. I mean, I love Donald Sutherland is one of my favorite actors. He liked the Montreal Expos. I grew up there. I was a big fan of that baseball team. He used to come every year. Anyway, Donald Sutherland in the JFK movie is the personification of the conspiracy, and it involves everybody, which I always found funny because, most Americans, and it's a thing that the right and the left share, Most Americans understand that our government is inefficient. Some people might like the government, but they'll know it's inefficient. And other people don't like the government, but they know it's inefficient. But everybody who's a conspiracy theorist assumes the government is super efficient. In that one instance, the government not only does this perfectly, but nobody talks. Nobody talks. Now, the long and the short of it is that because of the confluence of several different conspiracy theories in the 90s, JFK was killed because he was going to pull out of Vietnam. JFK was killed by Castro, who found out that the Kennedys were going to kill him, and they killed him first. JFK was killed by Soviets. JFK was killed by Southerners who were not happy about civil rights. JFK was killed by oil interests. JFK was, well, each of those, JFK was killed by the mob, okay? Each of those entails a series of documents, and the JFK Act created a collection called the JFK Assassination Collection. Well, it's huge. It's 5 million pages. And it includes each of these possible theories. Now, it's a boon to historians. We have been mining that ore since 1998. But the review board, a series of very honest, sober-minded, nonpartisan people, got to see it all. And some agencies and the FBI said to them, this document, which you can read, they had all the clearances, it's not relevant, is it, to Lee Harvey Oswald and the potential conspiracy? By the way, the goal of this process was not to tell Americans, tell us what happened, but to let us decide, right? This was not a Warren Commission redux. But they said, does this really, would this lead a reasonable person to know any more about Lee Harvey Oswald? And they said no. And so they said, well, let's not release it. So there's a bunch of that stuff. It's about 50, according to the National Archives website, about 50,000 pages were withheld in full, and portions of 550,000 pages were withheld out of 5 million. The law was beautifully written for historians, but badly written for government officials. There's a section that says everything in the so-called assassination collection must be released 20 years from now, unless the president at the time decides not to. Well, that kicked the can forward. So the review board did its work very well, disestablished itself in 1998. These were people chosen by Bill Clinton, but the act itself was signed by George Herbert Walker Bush. So this can has been kicked and kicked and kicked. And who would have imagined in 1992 that a Manhattan developer who was well known in 1992 would be the one to decide? And that's what this is all about. And these documents, I haven't seen them, but given I know something about where the holes are, these have to do with the murder of Trujillo, the murder of Lumumba, some U.S. policy towards Vietnam, though not many, but policy towards Cuba, because in 1998, Castro was still alive. And so there were war plans that were closed, and also code and cipher stuff, which, again, you can read this, but you'd have to be a nerd like me. I mean, it's a long, long, long report. But the National Security Agency found things that were responsive, but then they argued, look at them, they could see them. Is this really helpful? They said, no. Well, that stuff is in this collection. I think what happened today, I don't have any inside info on this, is that the agencies, which have been screaming, nobody ever expected this to come out, have been making their case at the White House. And that's why the stuff hasn't come out yet. I would be surprised, but, never predict these sorts of things. We're very bad at it anyway. I'd be surprised if it changes any top-line narrative issues regarding Lee Harvey Oswald and the conspiracy. And I don't think it'll change that many top-line Cold War issues, but it might, and it's certainly going to give us details about covert action. I'll give you an example of something that's closed. I don't know the detail, but I can tell you what's closed. The name of the CIA guy who took the poison to Congo to kill Lumumba, that's closed. It would be opened if this goes through. CIA doesn't like to open those kinds of things. Would it affect your knowledge of whether Lee Harvey Oswald killed Kennedy or not? No. But thanks to Oliver Stone, every possible conspiracy got thrown into the pot, and 5 million pages were the result. So that's my understanding of what happened.
And I think that, yeah.
Thanks.
And the thing that we both know as historians is that documents reveal things that nobody could have predicted. And what I mean by that is that for all the agencies going through this material, for all the review boards looking at this material, there will be things in there that some historian will say, actually, you thought this was irrelevant, but this is really, really important. And it may not actually be to do with Lee Harvey Oswald. It may be something...
No, it's likely to be about something else. No,
Yeah.
but here's the thing about it, which is our government, I mean, I think I've worked in enough foreign archives to tell you. Now, I did work for the National Archives, so I'm a bit biased, but our government has the best archival system in the world. Great Britain has a beautiful building, and it's very, very efficient, but Great Britain has a system where the government can destroy documents before they go to their National Archives. Now, I'm not saying our system is perfect, but we have a different kind of system, and so we can demand documents. You may not get them for a while, but we can demand documents in a way that no other country permits of their own materials. But because we have this right, we put a burden, a good one, I think, on all the agencies to review the documents. And this gets to Richard's point. Who reviews them? Sometimes they're retirees who don't know anything about the story. It's not that they were working on it. They don't know anything about it. So they might be told their list of code names they can't reveal, but otherwise it's their decision. And that's why those of us in the business know that you can have a document that's redacted, that means excised differently at the same time, because it depends on who did it. It's an art, it's not a science. So exactly, there are documents that would be keys to a big argument that the reviewer wouldn't have a clue about. So that's why it's always worth taking the time to go through the documents one by one.
And it's the great benefit of the system that there will be some PhD student focusing on some very narrow area who will be able to go through some of those. Well, they're millions of pages, but we'll identify some of those, and then we'll have an aha kind of moment. And there'll be PhD students around the world working on this, and together something will happen that we just simply cannot predict. So, as I say, it's a great day for historians when documents are released.
It's a pretty good profession, too.
It's great. We're actually very lucky.
Yeah, I would say. Sir?
Yes, I have a question about a question Kennedy was asked, and I don't know where I read this or who wrote it, but the question that Kennedy was asked from this thing I read, a reporter asked him, Mr. Kennedy, what is your greatest qualification to be a candidate for President of the United States? And reportedly, Kennedy responded, I have a sense of history. And my question is, do you know if that was an accurate account of something at that time?
I think, so did Kennedy have a sense of history? Yes, absolutely, he did. I mean, I think even the fact that if you go right back to his time at Harvard, where he wrote his senior thesis about the Munich crisis, and then subsequently published that as a book, the fact that he has the impetus to write Profiles in Courage, which he writes with Ted Sorensen, and which wins a Pulitzer. And even you just have to look at kind of simple things like, he reads the book review pages of newspapers and circles books and kind of sends out to his local bookseller from Hyannisport to kind of order these books in. He's reading all the time. One of the previous questioners referred to, I think, probably the Barbara Tuchman book on the Guns of August about the origins of the First World War. which is very much kind of on his mind, kind of around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So yeah, he's a great reader. He has this genuine sense of history. And coming back to what we were talking about before, ultimately, that's really, I think, why he likes having Arthur Schlesinger around, that, you know, he just likes talking history, thinking about things in that kind of historical context. And as the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrates, it does inform his policy making. You know, he is thinking in this kind of broader historical context. He does think about other presidents, particularly why he doesn't like presidents like Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt, because they are, well, to use Roosevelt's own phrase, because they're bully pulpit, kind of proselytizing presidents. He prefers presidents like Polk or Truman because they are practical, improving presidents who are looking in a very technical way at something that's wrong and to make it better. So that's a historical reflection. So absolutely, he is a president with history on his mind.
Yes.
Yeah, as historians, how do you feel, like here we are in the age of Camelot, right? Everything's looking fine. We're looking at JFK, everybody's feeling great. It's 1963 in the spring, things look wonderful. And then a couple of shots ring out and change history forever. Now, when you guys look at a thing like that, as historians, I mean, what goes through your mind? Because everything has just changed completely. And how do you, you know, like now you got to go from Kennedy to Johnson, and from Johnson to Nixon, and eventually to Trump. I don't believe I said that. But when you guys look at this stuff and you're not expecting it, none of us was expecting November 22nd, 63. And I lived in New York, and it was the first time in my entire life that in New York City, I could not hear a sound on November 22nd, 1963. Not a sound, not a bird, not a car, nothing. It was that dramatic. So how do you all deal with that? I mean, you have the initial shock, and now you got to go through what the heck happened and what is going to happen, because you have to kind of like, for lack of a better term, instead of being a historian, now you got to kind of like be a soothsayer. What's going to happen next? You know? So how do you guys deal with that kind of stuff?
And I think that, I mean, that's a very interesting question on all kinds of levels, one of which is that the Kennedy assassination is different for you than it is for me, because I'm a generation later, and so didn't live through, I wasn't, you know, I hadn't been born by when Kennedy was assassinated. So for me, it's all history. It's not lived experience. Just in the same way as I see with my own students now, not only do they not remember the Cold War and the Berlin Wall coming down, which is a kind of a seismic moment for me, they're a generation that they're now coming through. They don't actually have any memory of 9/11 either, because they're 17, 18 years old. So they experience something like that very differently. But I think that on the kind of the question of how you write history like that, I think that there are two different ways of thinking about it. That, you know, first of all, as historians, we always recognize the importance of, in this case, tragic, what we might describe as serendipity, that, you know, events happen that change the course of history. That if we believe in agency, if we believe that individuals make a difference, and I certainly do as a historian, then the death of a president matters. It means something. The transition from one president to another, it means something. But then we also think about the broader context that, and these are the kind of things that we debate, aren't they? That the Vietnam War, for example, which is a huge factor in America's history, subsequent history, it's the reason why historians argue about, well, would Kennedy have done the same thing? Was he on the verge of doubling down, or was he on the verge of pulling back? Historians have argued about that. The question of civil rights. There's an example that Lyndon Johnson, the great political operator, is able to take this kind of national tragedy and turn it into political capital by getting civil rights legislation through, by effectively kind of saying to even those who might have been opposed, this will be John Kennedy's legacy. So, yes, absolutely this matters, and it matters in all kinds of different ways. And the ways in which it would have changed history we can debate, but ultimately history is what it is. And, we write about what happened and try to analyze what happened and to understand the complexities of that.
I mean, there's a great debate about, as Richard alluded to, there's a great debate about, how much are we fish swimming in a stream? And the stream is going in a certain direction. And we have colleagues who would talk about forces, whether economic or cultural or social, that are beyond the power of one person. One person can delay, maybe half a generation, something, but it's going to be moving in that direction anyway. And what's clear to me is that we also debate how important we want our presidents to be. There are moments when we want our presidents to be really important, and there are moments when we want this period to to move beyond it to another period of history, if you will. And one of the things that Arthur had to think about in the 70s, because of Nixon, was whether he freighted the concept of the president with too much. Whether he had, in fact, created, if you will, a literary monster. And whether the system, the Cold War in this case, not Arthur by himself at all, but Arthur had imagined the importance of the president, had written books centered around the president, had defined ages by the name of the president, and whether that was a mistake in the context of this republic. And that's a debate that he had with himself, and he shared it with us in that book, Imperial. And we're having it again, I suspect.
And, it's also an example of him thinking as a historian, that he's still a professional historian. As you say, that, as he's kind of coming through at different stages, he's engaging with that Mark Bloch and the Annales School and people writing about broader forces and kind of change over the long period. But during the late 60s, he's also engaged in debate, sometimes quite acrimonious, with historians of the New Left, for example, and Barton Bernstein, and other historians writing about foreign policy, like Walter Lefebvre. And he goes along to a lot of these kind of graduate conferences. For example, he goes to George Kennan's graduate seminar at Princeton with people like Walter Lefebvre and Lloyd Gardner and these kind of people, because he wants to engage with these debates. And you're right, there's always a sense in which he's arguing with them, but he's also arguing with himself about the way in which history is understood.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.
All right, so I guess part of my question you have answered already, but let me just do this. So you mentioned we should study history, and we should also apply the history to the current event. But, everyone can study history. So everyone can learn some lesson. To the same history, different people will get different lessons. So are those really the lessons we learn from the history? Or it's just simply different point of view of individual people applied to the history matter and pollute the history? So
Pollute history, did you say?
yeah. My question is like this. Is studying history dangerous? So should we leave this job to experts like you? Or is there any simple method you can teach everyone so we can avoid the danger? So I myself is a physicist. So we know that in physics, some rules, it's very simple. You can tell the people. And so you don't handle the problem in a non-scientific way and waste your time. And this is very simple in physics. It's just shut up and calculate. It's very simple. So I'm just wondering, is there like a slogan you can give us so we don't get misled?
I think you'd take it the wrong way if we said shut up and calculate, though.
I certainly think that not to study history is dangerous. And when you think about regimes throughout history that have been totalitarian or kind of fascist regimes and authoritarian regimes, very often one of the first things that they come for is the articulation of history and try to kind of rewrite history in that kind of a way. But equally, you're right, even within the historical profession, there is a debate about the appropriateness of applying history. And I think that, Arthur Schlesinger is one of those characters. He was aware of the dangers, and he swam in some of those dangerous waters and was aware that he was doing it. But I think there's also a sense, to use your example, science doesn't happen in a vacuum either, that Rutherford split the atom, but that process can be used either for medical science, for radiation to treat cancer, but it can also be used to drop an atomic or thermonuclear bomb. So these kinds of decisions, if you think about the great decisions that we're facing now about medical ethics surrounding our DNA and kind of so on. So history in many ways is the same. There is a kind of a sense in which these are important questions. Many of them are toxic questions, but I think that actually historians debating them in the way that Tim was talking about with the things that are going to kind of be coming out, or maybe coming out today, that's what's important. And actually, if you think back to when Schlesinger was in policy making, it's also true in his history that ultimately his great friend, actually, Isaiah Berlin, has it right that it's all about pluralism. It's all about a diversity of views and approaches, and something in that process, something in that thing that we do shakes out a kind of an answer to these things.
I think that I believe that freedom comes from skepticism, but not cynicism, and it's a fine line. I don't think you'll hear any of us, anybody in this room is a historian. I know a few are historians, and those of us, I don't think you'd hear any of us ever call anything we did definitive. We don't use that term because we debate with our colleagues all the time. But we accept facts, the existence, just as you in science would accept things, okay? And so if you have respect for facts, I don't see the weaponization of history that you are talking about. I know how history can be weaponized. I mean, there are lots of cultures that have these pat views of the past that include hatred of their neighbors. And that's a weaponization of history. But if you permit skepticism and have real access to data, I'm not sure that it leads in the direction that you suspect. And by the way, it's a little like Churchill with democracy. It's, you know, what did he say? It's a terrible system, but the best that we have, or something like that. Tell me about the alternative of not studying history, where every day is Groundhog Day, where every mistake we've ever made in the past. I'm not saying, by the way, I mean, my professor taught me a lot about the fact that analogies are rarely that useful for policymakers. They're useful to ask good questions, but they're not prescriptive. But if you don't study the past, how could that be good? I mean, it'll make you vulnerable to stupid. By stupid, I mean based on nothing, but to silly, incoherent, and polemical views, because you don't know any better. You have no database. You have no data points that you can use to say, but what about that? To question it. So I think history has problems, and again, don't expect definitive history, whatever that is. But I don't know, I can't imagine the alternative.
And it's that, I always like that quote, often attributed to Mark Twain, because I think it captures what we're talking about here, that you know, the idea that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I think that's right, that, you know, as always, you know, even if he didn't say it, because it just has a ring of Twain about it.
He deserves it.
He deserves it. And, you know, if you think about kind of Mark Twain, someone kind of very much kind of in the news at the moment because of Ron Chernow's recent book, that, you know, he was friends with Grant, President Grant, and, you know, there's an element in which, you know, yes, we're not saying that what happened then is what's happening now, but we're just looking for resonance. And coming back to Tim's point, you know, ultimately, this is why the footnote, as boring as it sounds, is so important to the kind of the things that we're writing, because you can read Schlesinger, you can read One Hell of a Gamble, and if you don't agree with something, you can go to the footnote. If you think that doesn't sound right to me, you can go, in my case, to the New York Public Library, you can find the document yourself, and then you can say, no, he's got this wrong, he's misunderstood this. And that's why we don't just have one book on Roosevelt and one book on Kennedy. Somebody else will come along, hopefully not too soon, but somebody will come along and write another book about Arthur Schlesinger, because there's always more to be said. Each generation has something new to be said.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Oh, there's one. There's another one.
I didn't realize that you had run the Nixon Library. So since the question is, we're supposed to learn from history, what can we learn? Speaking, because it's true. I mean, our parents told us this. Learn from your mistakes. Don't make it again. Oh. So I've been told by some learned friends that one of the reasons we can't impeach our current buffoon is because he hasn't done anything illegal. And that historians, and I'm not sure where they quoted from, felt that the Republicans finally said, yes, we have to impeach Nixon because what he did was criminal, abuse of power, and all the things we think. Because we're right now in the middle of what you'll be writing about in 10 to 20 years. So I wouldn't mind a sentence or two or a paragraph.
I almost got through the evening without talking about All right.
Even as that question was asked, I thought, one for you there, Tim.
Okay. Well, I've done some writing about it, and I don't know if the audience really wants. I've got a couple of suggestions for you. I'm very proud of this. I'm proud of the group I worked with at the National Archives. If you go to the Nixon Library website and you go to the section on the Watergate exhibit, we digitized and scanned. We digitized the materials that are the footnotes, if you will, for our Watergate exhibit, and we tried to have evidence of almost all the abuses of power by Richard Nixon. And the evidence are documents and tapes, segments, and oral histories that we did. Go and familiarize yourself with this. It's our government. It's on a government website, and it's the perils of an abusive president. And there is no doubt, I believe, and the American people believed in 1974, there's no doubt that Richard Nixon deserved to be impeached, which it means indicted, and then removed. The House impeaches, the Senate removes. Bill Clinton was indicted. He was impeached, but he was not removed. Richard Nixon was told by senators of his own party that he'd be removed. When you go down those list of horribles, and you see the extent to which Richard Nixon used power to hurt people, to hurt his enemies, you will understand why he abused his trust. And I think that's a good standard for impeachment or removal. And I'll leave it up. I mean, I'm just one American, so just go look at that and make up your own mind.
First of all, I want to say thank you, Mr. Naftali, for presenting a really a point of view of integrity on CNN. It's really wonderful to hear from historians, you and Douglas Brinkley, and many of the commentators really bring a sense of logic, which is really greatly appreciated. I was really young during Kennedy's administration, but as I've gotten older and learned about the way the press reserved information, it didn't disclose everything about Kennedy, especially things that would be harmful, and deleterious to his presidency. And I realized that there was a lot of reserve in the press. I wonder if you would comment on freedom of the press and the future of freedom of the press in this climate under, the pressures of this president. And I'd just like to know your point of view about where you think freedom of the press and freedom of information is going.
I mean, as you rightly say, during the Kennedy administration, it's almost the last gasp of a particular kind of media environment. Edward Heath, who went on to be the British Prime Minister in 1970, but who was a cabinet minister at that time, pinpoints it to the early 1960s, and he says, until then there was respect. And the specific example he gives is when journalists start following him home. So there's a kind of a sense in which the press was much more respectful, that, for example, Eisenhower's private life in many ways, perhaps not quite as colorful as JFK's, but, there were indiscretions there too, none of which were reported. Once you get into the 1960s, obviously everything begins to change. I think it's television that changes that. And that's the trajectory that we're on now, because obviously living in the current digital kind of media environment. I think as well, the other thing that I would say that seems to be very different to me as someone who's moved to America from a different system is that in the early 1960s, there was still within the American media a sense of impartiality, that whichever network you reported for, there was a sense in which your first duty was to impartiality. That's something which is enshrined in law in the UK, that television companies have a duty for impartiality for which they can be fined if they're found to be in breach of that. The written press is very different. But, I think that there is a kind of a sense in which who today in the American media stands for detachment, for that kind of impartiality. Perhaps you could argue that some of the things like NPR and PBS and so on kind of have that. But it seems to me that they interpret that in a way that it, simply because of the environment, has to be very careful. So impartiality doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be, that you can't say that one thing is right or one thing is wrong, that you have to give equal to both sides, but it means that you have to be able to back up your analysis with data, with evidence, with facts, as Tim was talking about. So that's the thing that I would worry about going forward, that where is that going to come from? You know, when we want to know what is really true, what are the arbiters of that? And I think that that's as much to do with the new technology and working out how, as a society, we're going to deal with that. That's very complex.
Thank you for those nice comments, and CNN certainly gives me an opportunity to say what I think I should and to contextualize what we're going through. I want us to have time for this last question. Your last question.
I sort of have two questions. I'm just curious.
No, only one question.
Only
no,
question.
one.
Okay.
Sorry, we're running.
I'd like to have your thoughts on what seems to be a changing in our history, with so many statues being removed and taken out of view, and it's like we want to disassociate ourselves with all of this history, and yet that's part of our history. Whether we like it or not, that's been there. And I would like to have your thoughts on it.
I mean, obviously that is a very controversial topic today. My view about it is that it seems entirely justifiable to me that statues which quite obviously would give offence to particular communities should not stand without context. So what I mean by that is that statues, for example, of the kind in the South that we've been talking about, I understand why some of these statues would be removed, but I wouldn't wish to see them destroyed. I would wish to see them put into some kind of environment that provides context, that recognizes that they are part of the history of the United States. Because, the controversy is not something that is just from today. These are things which have been controversial and are born out of controversy throughout the entire history of the United States very often. So, in some ways, maybe my response is precisely that of a historian, that we don't want to wipe these things from the record, but we need to understand them in the context of history, to contextualize them, because I think ultimately by contextualizing them, we understand them, and then we're able, as a society, we're able to move forward.
I want to thank Richard and you for a splendid conversation. You now have an opportunity to purchase Richard's book and to enjoy it yourself. Thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much.
So great. Fun. Well done.